Hello, welcome to our video on recommended books from our book lists. We want to make you aware that good books are worthwhile companions on your journey through this life. There are a great many books available that have been written from an esoteric point of view. Most of them, of course, purport to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. How then does the reader choose? Perhaps some of the suggestions here will be helpful. Let us begin by suggesting that unless you are one of those rare and extremely blessed persons who are receiving confirming guidance from within, or from another higher positive unseen source that you know is dependable, you probably should not be reading every book that is recommended to you by others, even if they are well-meaning friends. That could take up an awful lot of your time. If you're in that particular situation, then the book list included here will be very helpful. However, if you are receiving such guidance that you know is reliable, then feel free to depend on that guidance to advise you in your day-to-day decisions, including which books you should read and which you should not. If, however, you are receiving guidance that you are not as certain is completely reliable, then please be careful. This speaker does not generally favor the idea of channeling, as it's come to be called, as a reliable means of receiving guidance, because it tends to encourage seekers to depend on sources that are outside their own higher selves, or outside their other two guides, one of which is at either shoulder. The motives of these outside sources that are channeled may or may not be in all that they seem. Instead, the seeker should ideally go within to the higher self, from whom initial unseen spiritual guidance would normally come. This guidance is sometimes called our intuition, our conscience, or even our still small voice within. You can and should encourage and develop a rapport with that positive inner source of guidance. There is information on how to do so in the videos concerning consciousness and meditation. Although this is not an overnight task and could possibly take years, once it's been accomplished, however, you should let the logical progression of spiritual development continue from that point onward. What you receive from your higher self may be sufficient for your needs in this incarnation. For some, however, there may also be input from one or both of the two other guides that were mentioned previously, one at either shoulder. Let it be said once again, however, since it is so important, that such spiritual development should not be expected overnight. It is, in fact, almost always a slow, steady progression that allows the lines of communication to be open very slowly over a significant period of time, perhaps years or even one's entire lifetime or longer. Even then, it will usually take place only if we have shown, over an extended period of time, the desire, the dedication, and the commitment that are necessary in order for someone to be given such a rare blessing. And it is not something that you take, it is given as a blessing. If you feel uncertain about the reliability of information that you've received from unseen sources, you can and should feel free to ask the source of any such information, "Do you come in the Christ Spirit?" The response must always be yes. Excuse me. If it is not, you may be dealing with the lower self, unless you've already released the lower self and it has been forced to leave by the brightness of the inner light that continues always to grow within the sincere seeker. There's an example of this in the book Brother of the Third Degree by Will Garver, as the negative spirit we call the lower self is released and leaves protesting loudly. Depending on the situation, you may even be dealing with some other, possibly negative entity, who may not necessarily have your best interest at heart. In either case, you may ask the question as stated above. If your beliefs are not Christian, don't be concerned. The Christ Spirit is universal, and the use of its name in such a question will not offend any if your motives are proper. It may even prevent a lot of grief by assuring that the information you receive is reliable. If you still feel uncomfortable, however, about asking that question, then by all means do instead that with which you feel most safe and comfortable. Although I cannot speak for other methods, I can speak only about that with which I am personally familiar. It will be helpful to say at this time that all of the books mentioned in this video are very worthwhile reading. As indicated earlier, these lists will be especially beneficial for those who are not yet receiving guidance from higher unseen positive sources. Excuse me. Note also that those books included on the first list here should be interesting and worthwhile reading for any person, regardless of the level of mystical and spiritual development they may have attained. Beginning with The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, the reading may become somewhat more difficult, but it is worth the struggle. It is not recommended that you try to read any of these works at one sitting. On the contrary, read for a while, and when you reach a reasonable breakpoint, put the book down and resume reading at a later time or date. This will give your inner consciousness time to properly assimilate that which has been read. These are not books that should be skimmed through quickly. That's very important that you remember that. Let me also say that there's no intention here to imply that these lists contain the only worthwhile books for the sincere seeker. There are many others, not the least of which are those that are used by the various religions or theological beliefs of the world. Those, of course, include, but are not limited to, the Old and New Testaments of the Judeo-Christian Bible, the teachings of Buddha, the I Ching, the teachings of Hinduism, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and others. The study of any one or more of these teachings, if done judicially, could be of a significant additional benefit to the seeker, and I encourage each of you to choose at least one of those with which you feel comfortable and read it as time permits. Excuse me. The following, however, constitutes the first list of books apart from that group that are also recommended to the seeker. At the top of the list is Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. Then Life After Life by Raymond Moody. There is a River. It's the story of Edgar Cayce. The Alchemist of the Rocky Mountains, a book by Frater Albertus. The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. Parzival by Wolfram von Eschenbach. The Aeneid of Virgil by, of course, Virgil. Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, both by John Milton. The Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri. And Jonathan Livingston Seagull by Richard Bach. There is a movie of that book which is also very beautiful. These books on the first list should give you plenty to read over the next few years, especially if you feel that you need to read them all. Perhaps there are only a few of those in the above list that you will feel drawn to read. You are the best judge of which to read and which to set aside. Just remember that they would not be listed here if they were not worth your time. Most of those listed above should be available at a used bookstore or a library or by mail order, depending on where you live. If these books from either list are not available in your area or country or culture, there may be comparable reading from sources within your own area or country or culture that you could access and read with equal benefit. I personally, however, can only speak for those books on the list provided, or for those otherwise mentioned here in this video. If you're truly interested, dedicated, and committed to bringing additional spiritual development into your life, there is below a second list of books that you may find even more interesting and helpful. These books, however, are not suggested for everyone because they may help bring about inner changes that could affect many aspects of your life. Although there may be some persons who will decide to read books from both lists during the same general time period, it is highly recommended as a rule that you finish those books that you need from the first list before beginning to read books from the second list. You will be the best judge in most cases, but it will be wise to evaluate carefully anything that seems to be a deviation from suggested reading. As a matter of fact, if you try jumping ahead, skipping over the things that may not seem important to you in order to speed up your spiritual development, especially when proper preparation has not been previously made, then you may have results somewhat like a person taking medication who decides that if one pill does some good, then a whole bunch must do even better. This is very dangerous thinking for taking medication, as you obviously know, and you may rest assured that it is also extremely unwise in matters involving your personal spiritual development. Don't feel that you need to be in a big hurry. Let it take a reasonable amount of time. As mentioned above, this kind of development should not be expected overnight. It is often the worthwhile work of a lifetime or perhaps even longer. And as also indicated, these books are not to be read quickly and at one sitting. You read them for a while, and then your consciousness, your higher consciousness, needs some time to assimilate that information. So you wait a while. Let's look now at the second book list. It begins with a book called Brother of the Third Degree by a man named Will Garver. The second book is Zanoni by Sir Edward Bulwer Lytton. Then Initiation by Elizabeth Heich. Morning of the Magicians by Louis Paulweiss and Jacques Berger. Forgive my pronunciations. A Dweller on Two Planets by Philos. The Spear of Destiny by Trevor Ravenscroft. The Seven Rays of the QBL by Frater Albertus. Life and Teaching of the Masters of the Far East, Volumes 1 through 5 by B.T. Spalding. This is the second book list. We hope that you will find interesting and worthwhile reading in the second list also. It isn't known if all the titles are still in print. If you have trouble finding them, check for a used copy in a bookstore that specializes in esoteric books. you might try online. I also highly recommend that those of you who have not done so already find and read a copy of the Rosicrucian Manifesto of 2011, published by the Rosicrucian Order Amorc, A-M-O-R-C. Good luck. Of course, you know you make your own luck. And good reading. That concludes our video on the books from our book lists. I invite you now to watch our next video on the subject of poetry, which includes several poems that we hope you will find worthwhile. Again, I thank you.